Uh, Thanks for the introduction. My name's Caylan Ford. I volunteer with the Falun Dafa Information Center as an analyst and an editor, and I'm also a master's degree candidate at the George Washington University's School of International Affairs. I just first want to thank the organizers for putting together this event, and it's a real pleasure to be in such good company among so many human rights champions here today. Today's theme, human rights and compassion, is quite fitting. As many of you are likely aware, practitioners of Falun Gong in China have been subject to systematic violence, mass imprisonment, torture in China for the better part of the last decade, in fact, for about 11 years now. This is, of course, fairly well known. It's been extensively documented, and so I'll try to touch on it only briefly today. What's less well known is how Falun Gong has sought to respond to the persecution in China. And that response has been shaped precisely by this belief that Falun Gong practitioners have in truth, compassion, and tolerance. I'll start with a little bit of the requisite background. For those who don't know, Falun Gong is a traditional spiritual discipline from China. It identifies as a Qigong practice, which is sort of similar to Tai Chi or yoga. It belongs to the Buddhist school. It consists of meditation, slow-moving exercises, as well as a moral philosophy, which is centered on these values of truth, compassion, and tolerance. There's no membership in Falun Gong, no places of worship, churches, fees. To practice Falun Gong basically means attempting to be a more altruistic person, letting go of sort of personal desires and the pursuit of profit and power and so on, and trying to just be sort of cultivate virtues, basically. In the late 1990s, the Chinese government estimated that some 70 million people in China were practicing Falun Gong. That's 70 to be clear, and that exceeds the membership that the Communist Party itself had at that time. This made Falun Gong probably the largest independent civil society movement in the history of the PRC. And anyone who's familiar with China knows that the Communist Party does not take well to independent civil society movements, particularly those with a religious or spiritual orientation. What Falun Gong represented to China's rulers was an alternate value system that was profoundly at odds with the official atheist ideology. Now, the PRC is, in a sense, it's a kind of theocracy, albeit a secular one. The Communist Party's mandate to rule derives from its claim to possess access to some sort of truths, based on the Marxist-Leninist ideology. It has its own vision of history, definitions of progress, and the fact that most people in China no longer believe in Marxist-Leninism does not make this less so. If anything, it simply means that the party may be more determined to suppress challenges to its ideological legitimacy. Now, Falun Gong and other religious groups challenge the party's ability to command faith and allegiance, where the Communist Party believes in the primacy of human agency. Falun Gong, as a Buddhist practice, believes in divine authority. Falun Gong believes that people are motivated by an innate compassion, that we're possessed of a conscience, whereas Marxism holds a sort of a materialist, determinist view of the world. And where the party has sought to enhance its legitimacy in the last 2 decades by fostering economic growth and encouraging the pursuit of profit, Falun Gong stresses that virtue is the only true source of value, and asks people to care less for personal and material gains. So not only was Falun Gong's value system incompatible with the official ideology, it was apparently also more compelling to a whole lot of people. Of the 70 million people who were practicing Falun Gong by the late 1990s, many of them belonged to China's intellectual, political, and business elites. And so on July 20th of 1999, then Communist Party leader Jiang Zemin forbid Falun Gong and launched a campaign to eradicate the group that continues to this day. To briefly go over some of the highlights of what that campaign has been characterized by, in the last 11 years, the best available estimates, such as those put forward by researcher Ethan Gutman, suggest that several hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of Falun Gong practitioners have been detained extrajudicially in prisons, labor camps, detention centers, psychiatric facilities, and so on. Torture against them is routine. The Falun Dafa Information Center has reported over 63,000 individual reports of torture in the last 11 years. In 2006, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Manfred Nowak, reported that fully 2/3 of the Chinese torture cases that were sent to his office were against Falun Gong adherents. and some 3,400 people, at least, have been reportedly killed as a result of torture and abuse in custody because they refused to renounce their belief in Falun Gong. In the last several years, new initiatives have been launched against the practice. In 2008, prior to the Beijing Olympics, 8,000 Falun Gong practitioners were abducted in a 6-month span by security agents. Many of them have subsequently been tortured to death or sentenced to very long prison terms, nearly 20 years on the high end. In 2009, Xi Jinping, who's actually the heir apparent to the communist throne, headed a campaign called 6521 that references the 60th anniversary of communist rule in China, the 50th anniversary of the Tibetan Uprising, 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and the 10th anniversary of the suppression of Falun Gong. And Xi Jinping was essentially charged with ramping up the intensity of the suppression against dissidents, including Falun Gong. And earlier this year, actually in sort of the early spring of 2010, documents started appearing on Chinese government websites that alluded to a new campaign which aims to re-educate and transform the minds of 75% of known Falun Gong adherents in China by the year 2012. So if all goes according to plan, in the next 2 years, several millions of Falun Gong practitioners will be taken forcibly from their homes and put into what Chinese authorities like to call legal education classes. We call these brainwashing classes. Now, all of this raises the question, why so many practitioners of Falun Gong in China, as many as tens of thousands by some estimates, have persisted in exercising their faith in this environment? Why don't they simply denounce Falun Gong? Why do they continue to persevere and even challenge the suppression policy? I've actually already alluded to the answer. Now, Falun Gong is suppressed because the Communist Party fears that if people believe in divine authority, if they seek moral or personal inspiration from a spiritual belief system, then the Communist Party loses control. The party dictates that a person's life belongs to the cause of communism. Dr. Pong alluded to this. When you join a Communist Party organization, even in elementary school, you swear your life to it. Whereas, by contrast, if a person is possessed of a spiritual faith, they believe that their life originates with and is connected to something that transcends this physical existence. They're thus far more impervious to control or coercion or threats, violence, or material incentives. They're their own people whose hearts and minds are not the property and subject of the state. So Falun Gong's capacity to resist elimination in China lies precisely in this belief, one shared by all religions, that life goes on in the hereafter, and that the state in which you exist in the next life is somehow connected to how you live in this one. So Falun Gong's faith holds that the virtues of truth, compassion, and tolerance describe the intrinsic nature of the universe itself, something that's eternal and undying. And if a person lives in line with these principles, connected to something greater than themselves, if they live a life of honesty, of courage, of compassion, and justice, then that act alone forges something that's everlasting, that they achieve a kind of immortality simply by being people of principle. To observers who don't believe in the afterlife, who are pure pragmatists, Falun Gong's response to persecution may seem like folly. I would say even if you don't believe in a hereafter, though, there's still something to be said for living a life devoted to principles, or maybe believing that virtue is its own reward. Posterity seldom remembers pragmatists. The great figures in history were people who were possessed of this belief that it was worth it to make immense personal sacrifices in the name of justice. If they had been pragmatists, these people, the Gandhis, the Nelson Mandelas, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, if these people had put their own personal immediate interests ahead of their principles, we would not know their names today, and we would not be able to enjoy their legacy. And this explains why Falun Gong adherents in China have resisted suppression, why they've not folded under threats and violence and torture. And the same rationale also explains how Falun Gong has resisted persecution in China. Falun Gong's response to the persecution has been centered on efforts to educate Chinese citizens about the true nature of the practice and about the suppression against them. They believe that if people themselves, if the Chinese people, the average citizens, refused to be complicit, that the suppression would essentially fall apart. If police refused to arrest innocent people, if teachers refused to turn in their students, and vice versa, if judges refused to be compromised and pass down these sort of judgments sentencing people to 2 decades in prison for their spiritual beliefs. If people refused to participate, then Falun Gong would have freedom, as would other Chinese people who seek their own personal beliefs and expressions. And so across China, Falun Gong adherents have established about 200,000 underground material sites, as they call them, in just about every county and district in the country. This is sort of China's equivalent of the samizdat system in the Soviet Union. From their living rooms, they set up secure internet connections. They use proxy servers overseas to download censored information about the persecution of Falun Gong. And then they produce it en masse and hand it out, usually at nightfall or to their friends and acquaintances. The guiding belief behind these types of efforts is that people are inherently good, and that if people simply knew the truth about what the Communist Party has been doing to them and to other Chinese people, their consciences will steer them toward justice. And so this is not an easy task. If you want to ask people to defy orders, for instance, to torture, to arrest people, this is quite challenging. You have to convince people to sacrifice their own personal short-term interests for something broader than themselves. And Falun Gong's approach to doing this is to try to appeal to people's connections to eternal truths and virtues, and to things that are greater and more lasting than any one of us. And the best example, I think, of this is what Dr. Peng Yubian already alluded to, and that's this Tweidong movement. Tweidong refers to, it translates as withdraw from the party, although technically most of the people who participate were not Communist Party members per se. They were members of the Youth League or the Young Pioneers. Most Chinese people were at one point members of these organizations. So this movement began in late 2004 with the publication of a book-length editorial series by a Chinese language newspaper called Dajiren, which is staffed principally by Falun Gong practitioners. The editorials are referred to as Jiuping Gongchandang, or the 9 commentaries on the Communist Party. And they detailed the Communist Party's rule in China with a particular emphasis on its human rights abuses and its record. Shortly after this document was published, the Dajiren, this newspaper's website, started receiving letters from readers saying that they wished to denounce their affiliations with the Communist Party publicly. Most of the people who do this choose to use aliases because a number were arrested after using their real names. And today, there are over 80 million names on Dajiren's website making these Tweidong statements. The numbers, of course, hard to corroborate. People use aliases. They don't leave contact information. But really, at the end of the day, it's very symbolic for them. And that's where I think the significance comes in. The 9 commentaries is not a sort of a traditional dissident document. It does not talk about changing the political institutions of China. It does not emphasize democracy. It doesn't draw on the ideas of Rousseau or Kant or Jefferson. Really, it draws on ancient Chinese sages like Confucius and Lao Tzu. It sort of pulls upon this notion of the mandate of heaven and that governments need to be virtuous and that society should be virtuous. It offers a vision of China's future that is fair and open and free, and is rooted in the practice of compassion. For many Chinese people who read this document, it's the first time in their lives that they've really come face to face with the truth of China's recent past. The famine that was the Great Leap Forward, the suppression of students in Tiananmen Square, the killing of members of religious minorities, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Falun Gong adherents. And upon learning the truth of these events, many people are so indignant that they had been deceived for so long that enough is sufficient for them to want to make this public declaration denouncing communism and stating that they will no longer support or associate with the policies of the Communist Party. To other people, however, people who may have been more aware of these events, having lived through the Cultural Revolution and these various political campaigns, the 9 commentaries is a kind of comforting reassurance that their memories were real, that their experiences were shared, and that their suffering is being acknowledged. The process of making a Tweidong statement and renouncing one's affiliations to the Communist Party means very different things to different people. Some people use the opportunity to finally candidly relay their true thoughts about Communist Party rule, things that they had previously been afraid to state openly. To others, it's a chance to share their own stories of victimization. Some people talk about the persecution of Falun Gong. They share experience of having forced abortions, of having their land taken away, of having family members killed in political campaigns, and so on. A surprising number of the statements are also made by the perpetrators of human rights abuses. Now, this is what I think is really touching about it. You have a lot of people who write in trying to seek forgiveness and attempt to sort of clean their conscience and find absolution in this movement. People who say that they were forced by the party to do these things, and who are now trying to make amends. One of the more remarkable stories that I've come across is from a soldier whose unit was ordered to kill unarmed Uyghur civilians in Xinjiang province. The man suffered from nightmares for years, and in his statement, he writes, "If God's hear my repentance, please grant me peace of mind so that I will no longer be terrified by this recurring nightmare." In all of the Tweedong statements I've read, one of the most commonly expressed sentiments, though, is surprisingly, it's not anger, and it's not frustration, and it's not a desire to seek revenge against the party or any such thing. It's actually an expression of relief, of freedom, and of hope for China's future. This movement was started by Falun Gong practitioners in response to the suppression against them, but it simultaneously provided an incredible platform for people of all walks of life to try to find peace and reconcile what has happened in China over the last several decades. So you have Christians, Tibetans, democracy activists, you have soldiers and policemen and intellectuals. One of my favorite statements actually is from a fellow whose surname is Zhang. And he wrote in his statement, "I declare my formal renunciation of the Communist Party. I cleanse its venom from my soul. I thank Dajiren's 9 commentaries for saving me and allowing me to pass the evening of my life in tranquility and peace." So while this effort to encourage people to renounce the Communist Party may look to be politically driven, when you look closer, you find that the message is not that Falun Gong should be in power or that a democratic revolution needs to be fomented. The message is that virtue and integrity, the cornerstones of Chinese society and Confucian and Buddhist traditions, need to return to China. The message is that China's greatness and the value of the Chinese people lies in that it is a culture that is characterized by an emphasis on moral courage and compassion and justice. Now, I began by addressing how to understand the origins of the campaign against Falun Gong in China. And I'll conclude by sharing how we hope that it might end. If you ask a Falun Gong practitioner how they would respond if one day freedom were afforded to them in China, they'll probably tell you that they'd like to go back to exercising and practicing meditation in the parks in the morning. They don't want political power, even after everything that's transpired. And they believe that the way to bring this situation about is by convincing the people of China that their greatness as a country and as a people is based not on their wealth or their power projection. Their value comes from the fact that they're people of justice and compassion. They are people who will not stand by passively as their neighbors are imprisoned and tortured. There are people who will sacrifice their short-term interests in favor of what is right. And in our best-case scenario, this persecution will end simply when the Chinese people decide that they are better than this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that moving discussion.